Hello, my friends. I hope you're all doing well. Slowly but surely, we are reaching a turning point. And no, I'm not referring to the battlefield in Ukraine, but to Europe as a whole. Now, where am I going with this? Well, over the past many months, the European Union has scrambled to find cash in order to finance Ukraine for the next 2 years. In fact, it was Ukrainska Pravda, the beacon of democracy, who told us just about a week ago or so that unless Ukraine receives well over 100 billion euros by April of 2026, the entire thing can fall apart. And I think you can imagine why the EU is now in panic mode. And here is where we get to the problem. Up to this point, the running theory in Europe was, look, European people, your money is safe because the primary source of funding for Ukraine for the next 2 years will eventually have to be the Russian frozen assets. The same Russian frozen assets which are now being held in Eurocal in the Belgian depository. However, this theory looks increasingly unlikely because Mr. Bard, the Belgian Prime Minister, he refuses to release those funds. So that has sent the European Union in panic mode and is now looking for contingencies. And this is how Plan A and Plan B have been born, the two contingencies. The problem is neither of these two plans is good news for Europe, and you'll see why once we get down to it. Also, we have Mr. Macron setting out conditions for what's to happen if Europe will eventually finance Ukraine for the next 2 years. So, without any further ado, my friends, let's just get to the bad news and let's see what's going on in Europe. The European Commission has proposed 3 options for providing financial assistance to Ukraine over the next 2 years. Bilateral grants, a loan backed by the EU through borrowing on financial markets, and a loan backed by frozen Russian assets. The wording of this paragraph is so sneaky. Let me explain why. Pay attention to the last option, which is the loan backed by Russian frozen assets. No, no, no. This is not an option. This is not option number 3, as this paragraph is trying to convince us. This was the main plan. Go and read any article you want from the mainstream media over the past 6 to 7 months, and you will notice every single EU official under the sun only referring to this option. At this point, can you even call it an option? Well, no, it was the main plan. As far as the other two are concerned, the bilateral grants and the loan backed by EU borrowing through the financial markets, those weren't even on the table up until about 5 minutes ago. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us exactly what we now see. The plan has failed or is looking like it's going to fail, so they need the contingency. Now, the reason they bundle it all together, option A, option B, option C, is because they want to present to the people an image of, well, these are our options, implying that they're all the same. They're not. Let's take a look at what each of those means in practice. Bilateral grants. Well, what this means is that individual EU member states will have to give Ukraine whatever they can spare from their budget. And here's the problem, the big problem. Most countries in Europe do not run a budget excess. In fact, I don't think any of them do. Most of them run a budget deficit. So how will they fund money to spare to give it to someone else? I think that question answers itself. Then you have option number 2, the loan backed by EU borrowing through the financial markets. This one will be extremely expensive because it will carry a lot of interest, and in the end, it's still the EU member states who will have to pay this back, right? It doesn't pay itself. Money doesn't just fall from the sky, as some people imagine. It doesn't. So then you get to option number 3, which was the plan all along, the Russian frozen assets. Now, the European Union has handled this in a very not good way. Let me explain what I mean by that. They thought that if they don't touch the Russian frozen assets, that would put investors and foreigners who have money invested in the EU at ease. Look, we haven't touched the Russian frozen assets. Those are still there in perfect safety. However, what happens from this point onwards with the Russian frozen assets is only of concern to the Europeans, to the Russians, and to the Ukrainians. The rest of the world, I think, has checked out already. And the reason I think they've checked out is because there's nothing to see here. The intent was there. And the intent, in some cases, is just as important as doing the deed. Let me make an analogy. Let's say you see someone having a clear intent to do something, anything. Can you then treat the situation as if nothing happened just because that person didn't do it all the way? No. You will still have that concern in the back of your mind because the intent was there. So this is why I'm saying this situation has been handled in a terrible way. But nonetheless, they try to present a situation where, well, there's three options, Jimmy. Each of them, well, all roads lead to Rome. They don't, I think they lead to financial ruin. But nonetheless, let's continue. Verlin called on EU member states to, quote, rapidly reach a clear commitment on how to ensure that the necessary financing for Ukraine will be agreed at the next European Council meeting in December. The increased level of urgency emanating from that statement is something astonishing. Ursula von der Leyen is basically saying to the European Union member states, look, between now and December, you rapidly have to reach a conclusion on how you're going to support Ukraine, meaning that they're going to have to bend over backwards just to find a way that works, implying that the EU member states will have to decide on one of the three options. The problem is Belgium is blocking one of them. As far as I can tell, the only thing that the EU member states can decide upon between now and December is which contingency they're going to adopt. We'll see what happens. But let's see. Van der Leyen's last statement of the article. Taking this forward will allow us to maintain pressure on Russia, deny the hope of victory, and lay the foundations for the suspension of hostilities and the groundwork for long-awaited peace negotiations, Van der Leyen said. In other words, if Ukraine gets this financing, this will lay the groundwork for long-awaited peace negotiations. Is that so? Because over the last 4 years, money was never an issue. The United States has chipped in massively under Joe Biden. The European Union has also put in a lot of money. The G7, the G20, everybody has chipped in. Money was not an issue, yet peace negotiations remained an illusion. So what makes us think that this $140 billion or whatever is going to lay the groundwork for long-awaited peace negotiations? Of course, this is just a way to justify the extra spending. That's what this is all about. Speaking of the spending, let's see what conditions Emmanuel Macron has set out, because once you go through what Emmanuel Macron is saying, especially his last condition, I think it will become apparent what this entire thing really is. Macron sets conditions for use of frozen Russian assets for Ukraine. Benjamin Haddad, France's Minister Delegate for European Affairs, has outlined the conditions that French President Emmanuel Macron has set for providing reparations loans to Ukraine backed by frozen Russian assets. Haddad said that one of these conditions is that the scheme needs to be in compliance with international law. It means it's not a confiscation of the frozen assets, but we can use it as an advance on Russian reparations. He's saying that this is not a confiscation of the frozen Russian assets. And that might be true, legally speaking, if they find a way to do it. But it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, because as I've stated many times, people around the world are watching what's going on, and they see where this is going, and they see the intent. So for them, it doesn't matter what language you use and what loopholes you find in order to make this happen. They've already seen whatever there was to see, and in the long term, this will affect the credibility of the EU. Let's see what condition number 2 is. Quote number 2 is, we need to have this guaranteed by the EU budget and work also with other G7 members on the financial guarantee. So we need to have the financial guarantee from member states, from the MFF, and from the G7 countries. In other words, they want this idea to be backed by Donald Trump. He wants the United States to offer guarantees. This is why they're saying G7, because the U.S. is obviously a G7 member. I don't see, though, Donald Trump being ready to offer them any guarantees, especially once you see his last condition, which we have finally got to listen to what they say at the last point. Quote, and finally, this needs to come with a strict principle of European preference, which is that if we have this loan, this reparations loan, it needs to support also acquisition and procurement within the European defense industry and the strong cooperation between the European defense industry and the Ukrainian defense industry. So what does this mean? Because it sounds very, very convoluted. Well, it basically means this. Emmanuel Macron wants the Russian frozen assets money to be used in order to purchase European weapons. In other words, French weapons, his weapons. Now, with this in mind, what sort of incentive would Donald Trump have to offer these guys any sort of financial guarantees? I will stress this one last time. I don't think Donald Trump has any interest in even being associated with this matter. At best, he would be happy taking money as payment for the U.S. weapons. But that's about it. Now, let's sum all of it together. Ursula von der Leyen just told us that this money, this financing for Ukraine, is supposed to lay the groundwork for the long-awaited peace negotiations. Emmanuel Macron is saying, well, it's actually supposed to buy European weapons. Which one is it? Because peace and weapons in my dictionary, they don't necessarily go hand in hand. They're not synonymous. This is the narrative that we have to go with, my friends. December will probably be a very interesting month once the European leaders all sit down and finally decide on what's the best course of action. But nonetheless, let's now see what the European Defense Commissioner had to say. Ukrainian troops could help defend the EU, says Defense Commissioner. And this comes from the Defense Commissioner Andreas Kubilio. Quote, it would be good that a battle-tested Ukrainian army, after peace has been established in Ukraine, would be ready to be present in all the countries of our frontier region, starting from the Baltic region and in Lithuania next to German brigade and the rotating U.S. battalions. Kubilio said in Vias, over the last 4 years, we've heard many interesting ideas, but this one right here is definitely right up there, right in the top 10. What Mr. Kubilios is saying is that, look, after the war is over, the Ukrainian army, the battle-tested Ukrainian army, can keep the EU safe. Well, I will say this. If the EU is so concerned about its own safety, first and foremost, they would look at the new security architecture. That's what keeps you safe more than anything else. Now, of course, they don't want to talk about that. So the next best thing is for them to take their own security a lot more seriously. Meaning what? Well, meaning defense spending, meaning a complete restructuring of the European armies, etc., etc. Because up to this point, Europe as a whole has been reliant upon the United States for safety. And that didn't work out so well. So why would you now rely upon Ukraine? I mean, it's just a rhetoric question. With that said, my friends, the latest news show that Mr. Witkoff and Zelensky will meet in Turkey tomorrow. Apparently, Zelensky is traveling there, and so is Mr. Witkoff. There's not much information available on this topic, but I imagine it will be a very hot topic either tomorrow or the day after. And with that said, my friends, I'll leave this episode here. Let me know what you think in the comments below. It's been a pleasure as always, and I'll see you tomorrow. Viktor Orban's statements spark controversy. Viktor Orban's recent comments have sparked a great deal of debate within the European Union, especially regarding Ukraine's chances in the war. Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, stated that Ukraine has no chance of winning the war. He mentioned that the EU has already spent 185 billion euros on supporting Ukraine, but questioned whether that money was being well spent, considering the situation on the ground. Orban pointed out that the EU's financial commitment to Ukraine is based on a flawed understanding of the war's dynamics, suggesting that the EU's strategy has already failed. He also criticized the prolongation of the war, accusing EU leaders of intentionally dragging it out to achieve a more favorable negotiating position for peace talks. He believes this approach is wrong and that it's damaging to Europe's future. The debate over European financial support for Ukraine. Orban made a powerful point about the financial burden Ukraine's war places on European countries, not just in direct spending, but also through the indirect costs of sanctions, rising prices, and higher taxes. He argued that the real cost of supporting Ukraine is far higher than the official number, likely surpassing €1 trillion. The proposed solutions for financing Ukraine's continued war effort have caused further concern. The EU is currently exploring several options, including bilateral grants, loans backed by EU borrowing, and loans backed by Russia's frozen assets. However, as Orban highlighted, the original plan involving Russian frozen assets is now at risk due to Belgium's refusal to release those funds. The EU's failure to provide a solid alternative has left the financial stability of the entire project uncertain. Orban's vision for European negotiations with Russia. Orban has long advocated for a more independent approach to European relations with Russia. He suggests that the EU should open its own communication channels with Moscow, separate from the influence of the United States, which currently dominates the negotiation table. He believes that having a direct line of communication would allow European leaders to negotiate without relying on U.S. intervention. However, Orban acknowledged that Europe's failure to establish these channels has put them in a weaker position. Instead of relying on Donald Trump to communicate their interests, European leaders should have taken a more active role in shaping negotiations. The reality of peace negotiations in European interest. In Orban's view, European leaders should prioritize the safety and economic interests of their own people rather than aligning too closely with Ukraine's war efforts. He emphasized that Hungary and other European nations should focus on their own future, particularly in terms of economic stability and security. Orban also highlighted the importance of establishing a new security system in Europe post-conflict. He warned that if the current trajectory continues, Europe would remain trapped in a cycle of conflict with Russia, much like the situation that led to the current war. He emphasized that peace negotiations should be rooted in realism, not idealism. Orban on Russia's long-term goals. When discussing Russia's long-term objectives, Orban stated that Russia's biggest concern isn't expanding its territory, but dealing with its demographic challenges. He emphasized that Russia does not need more land and that any aggression toward NATO or European countries would not make sense for Russia's broader strategic interests. The role of Ukrainian troops in EU defense. Orban also responded to the idea put forward by some EU officials that Ukrainian troops could play a role in European defense once peace is established. Orban disagreed with this notion, stating that Europe should focus on strengthening its own defense infrastructure rather than relying on Ukraine's military. He argued that Europe's dependence on the United States for defense has not worked out well and that it's time for European nations to take greater responsibility for their own security. Looking ahead, a shifting European strategy? As Europe grapples with its financial commitments to Ukraine and the ongoing conflict, Orban's views challenge the conventional thinking within the EU. His insistence on an independent European strategy, grounded in economic pragmatism and security, could set the stage for a significant shift in how Europe engages with both Russia and Ukraine moving forward. Orban's comments and the broader debate over European strategy will likely continue to evolve as the situation develops. December's European Council meeting will be a crucial moment in determining the EU's future stance on Ukraine and its financial support.